Welcome to our Q2 ERP data accuracy webinar. We have experts with us that are going to be talking about all things data and how to keep your data in your ERP clean, why it's important, and how to keep it maintained. So I'm going to give us about 30 more seconds to let those that are joining log on, and then we will get started. I should have had some music or song and dance prepared to keep everyone entertained here. All right, it looks like we are at start time. So we are going to kick off our webinar today, which is talking about ERP data accuracy. My name is Sarah Scudder. I run marketing at SourceDay. We work with manufacturers and help companies automate their purchase order changes. So data accuracy comes up in just about every single conversation that we have with those working in supply chain. I have asked 4 experts to come on and share their stories and advice and wisdom with us today. So we've got Susan, Matthew, Peyton, and Juliet. And the 4 things that you're going to learn, I always like to make sure that we have very actionable takeaways or things that you can look forward to in our conversations. First is how to set up a process to correctly input data. Second is how to use the COPE methodology to clean up existing data and set up good habits for new data. Number 3 is how to keep the data in your ERP clean after completing a data cleansing. And the 4th is how to get support from within your business to prioritize ERP data accuracy. At the bottom of the screen, you will see a chat and a Q&A. If you have questions anytime throughout our conversation today, please drop them in the Q&A and I will make sure to ask the appropriate panelist. And then in the chat, drop us a note, tell us your name, where in the world you are joining us from, and if there's a specific pain point or project that you're working on now around data accuracy, we'd like to hear about it. So drop that in the chat as well. Do not be shy. This is a very lively, active panel. So we want to hear from you throughout. Again, questions in the Q&A, notes and thoughts and comments in the chat. Okay, so with that, we are going to kick off and I'm going to actually ask Peyton our first question for today. Peyton, before I do that, I'd like to have you give us a really quick intro about yourself and who you are.
Okay, I'm Peyton Whitehorn and I'm an SAP Integration Advisor for Procure-to-Pay processes at Reveal USA.
So Peyton, my first question for you to kick off our ERP data discussion today is, what have you found to be the top causes of bad direct spend data in an ERP?
So as a master data nerd, I start at the higher level, which is poor master data governance. So lack of approval processes. We've got misspellings and duplicates because we don't have roles and responsibilities assigned. Uniform entry processes. Outside of that, things like pricing being up to date. Are we updating pricing in the system, or are we just doing it PO by PO and we're never putting that in there so that we can get accurate pricing data? Grouping your materials properly in their categories, whether it's on the GL side in accounting or on the procurement side. If you have different groups that you put your spend categories, are those right, and are the materials in the right groups that they belong in, so that when you do a spend analysis, the numbers are accurate. Then on the supplier evaluation side, you see delivery dates that may not be captured against what was the actual promise date, making sure we're updating those statistical delivery dates or not, as the case may be. And then if you have a lot of different sources communicating with your ERP system, there can be some issues there with too much data coming from different sources and not having a single source of truth. So I think that's where I'd start.
There's a lot to unpack in what you just said. So we've got people joining us from all over the world, which is super fun. We've got John giving us a shout out from Clearwater, Florida. We have John P. joining us from Austin, Texas. We have Raina from Wisconsin, who is currently implementing ERPs at over 6 sites. She is on her 3rd site now. Her big challenge is combining purchased materials across the platform. We already actually have several questions coming in already, and we have Laura from London, UK joining us, and she is here to support the awesome Susan with a smiley face. So Juliet, next question for you is, what is the biggest ERP data challenge you are personally experiencing in your company today? And before you answer that, I'd like to have you give us a quick intro.
Thank you, Sarah, so much. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real honor to be on this panel with some really amazing people, as you will all hear some of our inputs. I am Juliet Sampson. I am the CIO at Genpro. I have a pretty long career that started in all different industries, but most recently I was at World Finer Foods, which is a food and beverage company. I was their CIO and head of supply chain. And prior to that, I was in Fortune 50 companies doing mergers and acquisitions in the telecom, Wall Street, and pharmaceutical industry. I forgot the question, but now I remembered it, Sarah. So let me talk a little bit about ERP, which is Enterprise Resource Planning. It clearly automates our business, and it centralizes our data. It improves our business process and operations and performance. It enhances our data security and data quality, and therefore data reporting. It automates our workflows and reduces our costs, and it improves our customer satisfaction and collaboration and visibility. So I kind of wanted to establish that because it's all data-based, and therefore the quality of the data is very important. And we keep talking about the quality and we keep talking about the data, but in reality, we want to make sure that when we implement an ERP or when we re-implement an ERP, what goes into it is cleaned, meaning that we're looking across all of our business. Key point is not looking at it from one department perspective. This is an operational transactional system with the single source of truth of your data. So you want to take a look at across all of your departments, AP, AR, which is financials, inventory, PO acknowledgements, sales orders, your entire process you want to take a look at and want to make sure that your business process is well understood before you do any implementation. And through that process, you have to take a look at not just the business process, but what's the data. So my biggest challenge in short, and then I'm going to stop and get into other aspects of the data, but the biggest challenge is to get the right data and to keep it clean.
So Juliet, Adrian Sutton is joining us from the UK and has a comment and a question. So I'll throw this over at you first, and then we'll see if Matthew or Susan want to add. So the biggest challenge that this person is dealing with is, how can you get ownership for master data like inventory items that are entered and managed by multiple teams, but no one wants to own the data set?
That's a great question, and it's the biggest problem in a manufacturer. So typically, and again, I'm just going to give you my perspective. I'm sure there's many different ways. My perspective, my personal experience is that you have an item master owner. You have an item master owner. And that is very important for everybody in the business to know on who that is. And as items are getting added, and I'm actually going into more detail here, but as items are getting added, you don't add it just because you have a purchase order and you got to do it today, which most people do. And then you add partial information and it messes your entire workflow up because you're not going to be able to identify your transportation needs, your inventory needs, unless you go through the item master process. And we have devised in my previous assignment a process, and that meant that we have something called an item data upload form. And anytime new data comes in, we go and we ask the product manager to fill in this item setup form, which then gets uploaded into your Oracle or into your SAP or into your Dynamics ERP. And you do not upload this information until all of the parameters are filled in, and I'll go into what those are. And it doesn't get assigned, and you have to have sign off from marketing and sales and finance. These are the three key areas which I would want to have sign off every time a new data set gets added. And when I mean a data set, in my mind, is really a SKU. So a SKU, an item. And I think that the key aspects of this upload form, there are many data entries, but the key ones, in my view, is the size, the weight, the number of items per case, the number of items per pallet, the cost of the item, the owner, the vendor, the brand. I'm sure there's many others, but these are some key ones because they're going to help you with your inventory. They're going to help you with your logistics. So you can figure out, can you fit this on a truck and how much can you fit in a truck for a TL, for an LTL. So it's really, really important to go through this process. It is not a process that people like to go through. People tend to do this very fast because I got to add this SKU and I got to sell it. But it is so super important to keep your data clean and usable, because if part of this data is not there, let me tell you, you can't transport that SKU. You cannot transport it, or you're going to get bad data. And, you know, I love to get into a conversation about further questions, but I guess this is my short answer, Adrian.
So Adrian also added, I would add engineering manager to this data set sign off as they up rev items when changed, and sales, CSM, warehouse, finance, and marketing all need to sign off as well.
I do not disagree. I think it depends on the company and how they're structured, but absolutely, absolutely. And I would just look at and basically decide with the leadership team, because at the end of the day, you have to have buy-in on this process. And if you add a tremendous amount of people, you're going to lose folks, right, in the process. But absolutely, those are key decision makers on your team, then you should add them to the approval process. And by the way, that approval process can also be done in an automated way through your ERP.
So Matthew, couple questions for you. I asked a similar question to Peyton, but you're in a different role and would like to get your perspective on the top causes of bad direct spend data that you are personally experiencing in your ERP. And then why is it so gosh dang difficult to get buy-in from these key stakeholders that Juliet and Adrian just discussed? And before we tackle those, if you could do a quick intro so we know who you are.
I am Matthew Papalardo. I lead the procurement for Go-Go Squeeze, the applesauce in pouches company. I've been there for 6 years, and prior to that, my background was in controlling for several years, and I started my career as an SAP implementation consultant. So I have seen ERP from different angles in my career. I think I'm gonna relate to what Peyton mentioned earlier in the causes for bad spend. Specifically to us, is what we buy by nature is very, the PO that we cut are very fluid, because the price is changing every quarter. The quantity is never exactly the one we order because there is this tolerance with the suppliers. the delivery date is always wrong almost. I mean, I'm pushing it a little bit, but we buy quite a bit from overseas. And with the delays, the ocean freight, you're pretty sure that by the time you cut the PO, your delivery date on the PO is wrong, because there is no way you're going to be exact 2 months away from the actual delivery. So that's just the essence of the data. It's wrong to begin with. So the question is then, how do you make sure it's correct? How do you make sure it gets updated when it needs to be? So unless you have a tool that does that for you, you need a process. You need a way to have that data constantly updated to reflect the reality of things. And then the process is who owns it, and that has been said before. Like typically in my company, I'm gonna make the example of my company. We procurement, we negotiate the deals, and I'm gonna take an example. For example, we're gonna book 5,000 tons of the specific puree out of South America. We negotiate a deal, and then we let the plants cut the POs to bring the product as it's needed for production. Now, what if the PO is wrong on the price, on the delivery date? Who owns that? Is it the plant people because they're cutting the POs, or is it the procurement people because they own the relationship with the supplier? So yes, the process is key, but ownership is also key. So if you don't have all of that, then you have bad data. I guess that's my answer to the first question. To the second question about the buy-in by key stakeholders, well, also because ownership is key here. If nobody owns it, well, nobody's going to push for a resolution. If it's strictly in one department, you can be sure that the head of that department is going to push for a solution. If it's in between departments, who's going to push for that? Everybody is going to get frustrated, but nobody is going to actually act on it. Also, I don't think it's that easy to put a number. Like you want to invest in a solution to fix your bad data. How do you tie that to your bottom line or your top line or like actual financial numbers? Yeah, it's going to improve collaboration. It's going to reduce frustration. It's going to improve productivity. But what's the dollar amount to it? It's hard to estimate the return on investment for such an investment. So for that reason, I think it's hard to get the buy-in unless you have a very big visible issue because of bad data, in case people are ready to act on it. But other than that, it's just not happening.
Mm-hmm. Susan, who is joining us from the UK. So we also have a global panel, which I love as well. So Susan, would like to have you do an intro, and then question for you. You have a very different perspective on this panel because you're not on the buy side and you're not on the consultant side, and you are living and breathing, cleaning up bad data every single day. So I'd like to get your perspective on the biggest issue you personally are seeing manufacturers are having this year with their ERP data and why.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Walsh, known as the classification guru, fixer of dirty data. I've been cleaning, classifying, and normalizing suppliers in the procurement space for about 11 years now. So I've seen it all pretty much. And I think it's particularly in the manufacturing space, it's multiple versions of the same item. That's a big problem. It's the same thing, but it's been abbreviated, slightly worded differently, and it creates multiple versions of the same thing. So that's something I see quite a lot. And then like if you want to go really generic, most of the time a lot of it's just wrong, plain and simple. So yes.
Susan, do you have any insight as to why this happens over and over again at the same company? I mean, it's, we work with companies and it's like, well, their data's been bad for 10 years and it continuously is bad.
There's a little bit of laziness, no willingness to actually do what needs to be done. The other problem is that you might have multiple people on your team all inputting that data and they're all doing it slightly differently. So then, and I know specifically when it comes to classification and categorization, it's very subjective. So you can have more than one right answer. And it's just people's different perceptions or opinions. So it's those kind of things that are causing the issues. But it's hard to motivate people sometimes to actually want to do it properly.
Yeah, because for me, if I'm thinking about it, it's extra work and it's time consuming.
Yeah, what's in it for me?
Cumbersome.
Yeah, exactly. What they don't really understand is the impact it has on their colleagues or who could be their friends in the next department or the next couple of chairs down, who are spending hours solving delivery problems or warehouse issues because this person didn't put the right units of measurement into a product or something like that. So it's if they can understand the impact of their work on their colleagues, I think there's a better chance of getting people to help make the data more accurate.
Mm-hmm. Peyton, we have another question from Adrian. So I appreciate him being so engaged and having so many questions and comments. So Peyton, I'm gonna ask this one to you. It's how do we sell ownership to directors on value and risk and make sure that they are owners assigned?
Okay. Selling the ownership. So I think it's really about the risk. Owning the materials and having a uniform process in the way in which the materials are managed, is mitigating risk of what exactly Susan's talk about, and I mentioned briefly, having your duplicates and having bad data when you run these reports. In our work with Reveal, we tend to advocate for the ownership of the material data to be on what's called the MRP controller in SAP. It may be the same thing in different modules, but it's ultimately the person in charge of doing the planning for the material. And so that's how we would say that the ownership should be assigned, because they're in the day-to-day of how the material works. And in what we say, we're aligning business behaviors with business rules so that the system is doing the heavy lifting for us. I'm not sure if that entirely answered the question, but that's kind of where I would go with it. I think it adds value in the mitigation of risk, ultimately.
Yeah. I mean, the question was around selling internally, right? How do you sell this ownership to people internally at an organization?
There, something that might work is if it's tied into performance. So if it's something that can be measured and it's like bonus related, then that is motivation. Just on the ownership thing as well, I'd always say never put it all in the hands of one person. Always share the ownership, because that person could leave, they could get sick, they could lose their laptop, and then all that, everything is gone. So kind of mitigate the risk by spreading the responsibility. I think it's always, it's quite dangerous if you have just one person. And again, they could have an opinion that's different to the rest of the business, but they're in control of the data, so they get to say what happens. If you've got a few different people with different perspectives, then you get a more balanced, hopefully, data set as well.
And I will add
sorry.
I'll just add, convince your CFO, like just find a way to show that bad data is bad financial result. It's not that direct relationship, but it's the reality. If you have the buy-in from the CFO, then ownership is going to be decided right away.
I wanted to add to this conversation and kind of reiterate some of the comments made. I also believe that it's all risk driven and you follow the money, and you need to have an impetus to clean up data. People don't just clean up data. You have to have an impetus, and the impetus typically is either make more money, get better margin, turn around the company. My last company, we did a major turnaround. We looked at everything and having KPIs. And I think we mentioned measuring people's performance, but it's not people, it's measuring the business performance. So one of the things that I mentioned is about how to clean data and how to put good data into the system. But what I didn't mention is you also have to deactivate your items. You also have to clean out stuff that you don't use. So as an example, I'm talking about food and beverage. In my last assignment, we had 1,400 SKUs in our system. And we did a re-implementation of Oracle, and we reduced that to 800 SKUs, which is a big reduction. And how did we do that? We looked at either items that don't turn, in other words, we're not selling, right? And so if we're not selling, why do we have this item, right? So we looked at the top 20%, the bottom 20% of turns. We looked at how is this SKU turning. If it wasn't turning, if it's in the bottom 20%, let's assess if we need to keep this product, right? And also it improves on your inventory, it improves your overall, and you can clean out your data. You put a KPI for closeouts or for write-offs. So in the food and beverage, you have a expiration date, and those products that don't turn, they're sitting on your inventory, they close out, they're no longer good. You have to have closeouts. That's a complete loss. That's a loss on your bottom line. So these are all impetuses to clean your data. And so it's really important to not just put in new data appropriately with your upload form that I described before, but also to deactivate those items and to clean out the things that you don't use. Somebody talked about duplicates. Clearly, we need to make sure that that doesn't happen. But you have to hold your team leads responsible for their department clean data. So answering the questions that we had is how do we make people responsible? We have to give them the visibility of what this data causes from a financial perspective. Always follow the money and have that visibility. So if you then provide that visibility of every level in the organization in terms of what this means for either your revenue or your margin or your closeout, people are going to get a sense of it, and they're going to be more interested in keeping it clean.
Matthew, I want to change our conversation a little bit to talk about something that's very near and dear to my heart, which is around purchase order changes and the nightmare that those can cause when you issue a purchase order. Your supplier comes back with price, quantity, and delivery date changes. There's a lot of manual work back and forth, typically done in email and spreadsheet, and then manually going into the ERP and making those changes. To Peyton's point, very high risk. If that's being done manually, lots of room for typos to be made, things to be missed. So I'd like to ask you, since you're a chief procurement officer, how big of an issue are PO changes? And how does this this impact your revenue as well? So why is it an issue and then how does that impact the revenue at your company?
So it's a pretty big topic for us. I mentioned earlier that we buy quite a bit from overseas, so we have a lot of POs that change all the time. I will probably say at least a good third of our POs needs to be updated, and that's on a more normalized supply chain context environment. When we were during the pandemic and right after the pandemic, it was probably over 80% of our POs that were that needed some adjustments, because a lot of suppliers were very tight in their inventory, so pushing delivery dates, not receiving their own raw material to produce for us on time. We had daily calls with a bunch of suppliers to go PO by PO, making sure what was true the day before was still true. It was a nightmare. It was very tedious, and still we had issues. We had an instance where honestly, I don't remember if the quantity was wrong or the delivery was wrong, but basically something was missed despite those weekly daily calls. And what we thought we could produce a given week, we could not. And it was a very specific item for a very, very specific customer of ours, private label. And because we were not able to fulfill that order, we got basically we shorted our customer, and we got quite a big penalty for that. So that directly impacted our revenue, like simple math. So earlier I was mentioning it's hard to get buy-in from stakeholders. When something like that happened, well, it's so visible because it ties directly to your bottom line. That makes things very visible, and that makes people buy in on finding a solution. So yeah, pretty big for us. Even today, in a normalized world, and yeah, it's almost a daily topic in my company.
I wanted to add something to what you're saying in that the negative impact. I mean, yes, we see it on the bottom line. We see it on customer orders being late or not in full, but the quality of life of the buyer is also greatly impacted by the fact that the data is bad. Spending time on the manual processes, answering the phone calls because something's late or everything's hot. I mean, that's a huge deal from a negative impact perspective.
Absolutely. And that's what I think I was saying that before, like we all know it creates frustration, lack of collaboration, demotivation, right? The people that have to deal with that. But how do you tie that to follow the money, as Julia was saying, so it gets fixed? But yeah, I mean, that's why I think it's a daily topic, because I hear frustration every day on this topic. So absolutely with you here, Patrick.
Susan, you deal with a lot of companies that have gone through mergers and acquisitions at some point in their life cycle.
Oh, yeah.
So I would like to have you talk about why these mergers and acquisitions result in such crappy data.
Oh, where to start? Well, first of all, within one company, you can have multiple ERPs. And then if you buy another company that also has multiple ERPs, I mean, I think I've heard of companies having up to 75 different instances of various things.
Which makes me absolutely cringe.
Yeah, it does. And the problem with that is, again, different companies, different styles of working, different ways of inputting data, different people having different styles of inputting data. So a classic example is PwC. You could have PwC, P.W.C, PwC Inc. Limited. You could have PricewaterhouseCoopers. I've seen that spelled a lot of different ways as well. And that's all within one single company from lots of different instances. And then let's not even get started on when you drill down to more detail like addresses, and you've got abbreviations or not, people who do street or ST, avenue, AV, typos, misspellings, we see that too. And it just creates even more and more records for the one supplier, or if it's one product as well. You know, we can see a number of ways I've seen screws abbreviated can be huge. You know, some companies don't even have SKUs or part numbers associated with the material description. So then that creates a whole load of problems as well. It became very hard for them to then be matched up together when you join systems. I mean, there's so many different things, but ultimately it's the same thing in just various different versions, lots of times.
So Susan, John says this could be an encyclopedia worth with the possibilities on this topic.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I could sit and talk about this for days, happily.
So I want to make sure that our audience today leaves with some really actionable things. I think it's pretty clear and straightforward that there's bad data at most companies and bad data is bad, right? I think we've established that foundation. I want to make sure that people walk away here with some actionable things that they can actually do to fix this problem and clean up their data and hopefully keep it clean ongoing. So Susan, I'd like to have you start with, how does someone even go about setting up a process to correctly input data?
So first of all, I think whatever you do, it has to be simple, because quite often people who are inputting the data are not necessarily data people or have anything to do with that space. And so you need to make it as easy for them as possible. Don't give them too many options for things like drop-down menus, or free text can be an absolute nightmare. It's really important to understand the whole process as well. So not just the part, like I was saying before, how that piece impacts the rest of the business. Like if you don't get that right, by understanding the whole process, you can then put in place at the very start the things that need to be done. And I think it's really important to, again, share with the people who are working on inputting that data, like their role, the importance of it, and how it can make a difference for them as well.
Julia, you are living and breathing this every single day as the CIO. I'd like to have you share, what is your data input process? How have you set something up with your team?
So, as I described a little bit earlier, one of the processes that we set up is this item master upload form, which we want to make sure that is fully complete before we put it in our system. So it's actually an Excel file. And we do want to fill out, we do identify which ones are the musts and which ones are the nice to haves. And like Susan mentioned, we don't give them too many options, so it's a drop down. And we do have to sign it off by the key stakeholders, like we talked about earlier. And there's one person, obviously there's backup to this person if they are out sick or whatever. But we do have one person that this has to go through. And nothing gets into the system until it goes through this process. And this process could take an hour and it could take days. So I am very mindful, and I resonate with Susan's comment that you have to make it simple. Which is why if it's something that they can see all the time and they're aware and they understand that there's no way around it, then people are very interested in doing it and doing it fast. So as I said, it's an upload form. I mentioned it earlier. And of course, this has to do with, item master data, right? There's many other data facets. And each department is responsible for their own, but this is sort of a general item master, and and it's related with SKUs and with the items that we bring in. And we want to make sure that all the attributes of that item is defined, and it's defined when you set it up before you engage in selling it.
Peyton, one of the things that I think is really important about these data input processes that Julia and Susan have been talking about is having clean input to data to even input, right? So having this process is important, but what can procurement teams do to clean up their ERP data? I think that is like so important and often missed.
So I think a lot of it is just, it depends on what data they have ownership of. So I'll tell a story from my personal experience to kind of get into that. Many moons ago, I took over buying packaging for a textile manufacturer, and everyone was calling me that their stuff was late. And I was sending POs to the supplier, and they're like, none of your lead times are right. So I was sending things in my PO with a 7-day lead time, and the stuff had a 14-day lead time. So from there, I compiled a spreadsheet of all the SKUs that we ordered from that supplier, and we reviewed all of the planned delivery times for all of those items and cleaned all of that up. We also cleaned up the pricing that was in the system because a lot of it had not been updated. So I'm pulling in, I was counting on my order process to have what I needed at the price agreed upon in the time frame for it to be available, and none of that was right. So we had to do a lot of cleanup in reviewing, working with the supplier in conjunction, because at the end of the day, my production team is going to be happier because they're getting their stuff on time. My supplier is going to be happier because they're not getting a PO that's wrong. And then the customer's happier because we're quoting accurate lead times of the end product. So it does take a bit of work, but it's well worth it in the end to streamline that process.
Yeah, it's shocking to me how many companies that I've worked with that have bad data, and I don't know if they don't realize or what it is, but they don't take the time to actually clean it up. And then they buy a new system, then they're inputting bad data. And it's like, I know Susan knows.
Like if you can't see it, it doesn't exist. Like if you don't look at it, then it doesn't exist. It's once you start like digging into it, that's when all the problems occur.
Yeah. So we have a question from Larry, who is joining us from Canada. He says, depending on the size of the organization, do you think there's a size where it makes sense to dedicate a single person to this endeavor? And I think, Juliet, he was referring to your comment.
Yes, absolutely. And depending on the size, you may need more than one person. So at my previous company, which was 100 people, 200 million in revenue, we had one dedicated resource. Of course, at Pfizer, where I have 1.1 million people and 70 billion of revenue, you have several people doing this kind of a role. So very much it depends on the size of the company, but it is such an important role. And I agree, it has to be the right person who's actually interested and really likes numbers and likes the data. And it also has to be somebody that's very personable, that can really go after people and in a nice way, right? Because you don't want to be like a nuisance, because that's not going to help anybody. So you kind of want to be collaborative, and you want people to understand why this is important. Sarah, before we also talked about, getting clean data to put clean data into your system. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, like I know, Matthew, you're in the purchasing side, right? So, I know that, we were representing third-party brands. So we were buying other people's brands, and we were representing them in the United States exclusively. So you're only as good as what the data from that brand company is, right? So you have to get the data from someone, and then you put it into your system. As long as you have that information, you put it in your system so you can sell the product. That doesn't mean you cannot go back and adjust. So we have had situations where, for example, the size or the volume or the weight was not correct. And then we put it on a truck and we outweighed the capacity of the truck. It's happened. So then we have to go back to the vendor, to the brand owner, and say, you gave me the wrong weight, right? And now I have this shipment and it's stuck and I have a closeout, and it causes a huge mess. But the point is, the message I'm trying to say is, yes, you need an individual, and yes, you can go back and make changes, and you should make changes.
Mm-hmm.
I see that quite a lot. And actually, one thing that, because supplier manufacturer data can be really bad. And something that you might be able to do to help yourself is if you get new products and you look at all the similar sized products, just to see that the dimensions and the weights are all the same. If there's something that sticks out that's like significantly higher than everything else, then that's probably worth, double checking with whoever. But sometimes, just a random story, but I used to tender for dental products with the NHS, and one of the questions that they wanted to know was how many individual bristles were in a toothbrush. So we had to literally go back to the factory in China, because I was at the point of getting ready to count them, but we did, and it's so sometimes, the manufacturer might not necessarily anticipate the information that you might need for your business. So, and that's where there can be gaps in the data as well.
Absolutely, Sarah. So that's a good example. And I can say to you that in many cases we build website, we have our website and we put our product on the website. In order to put it on, you have to have the right dimensions. So we went through a process where we got the product from the manufacturer, we sent it to our website team, they did the measuring and the weighing. And then if I had a discrepancy, right, then I had an issue. But sometimes we double check, to your point, to make sure that the dimensions, the weight, and so on is correct before we actually input it into our ERP.
So Matthew, we talked about cleaning up your data, why having a process to input your data is so important. I think another element to this is then how to keep your data clean ongoing. So would like to have you share if you're working on something or have done something in the past that you have felt that has worked or helped keep your data clean ongoing.
So we do two things to fix the lack of ownership I was mentioning before. We basically have a person dedicated to this job now, and that was said before. Something that needs to lack that kind of data crunching and data fixing, but we have a resource that does that for us. So that helps us clean or keep the data as clean as possible on an ongoing basis. But of course, there are misses because it's a human, and that will always happen, a typo, a mistake. So now we also do a yearly cleanup, yearly cleansing session where we look at every single attribute of our SKUs and every item number we have, and we don't have that many. So maybe let's start with that because it's easier for us to do that because we have probably over 100 SKUs, not 400,000 like I heard before. So it's much easier for us to do that yearly check. But yeah, it's a routine. It's like you will do a yearly audit. We do a yearly data verification, and that helps tremendously. So a resource dedicated every day to maintain accuracy, and then a yearly cleansing session with every team that needs to be involved in this.
So Susan, you have something called coat, which I was joking about on LinkedIn because it's freaking hot in Austin and I can't imagine wearing a coat right now.
Honestly, in the UK, it's pretty chilly. We could do with some coats here in the shades.
So I would like this discussion is specifically geared towards people working in manufacturing. So I want to make sure you describe this as it's going to relate to a manufacturing audience, but would like to have you explain what it is and how people working in supply chain and manufacturing can use this methodology that you've come up with.
Yeah, I created this as a way, again, to try and get everybody involved in the process, not just the technical people. And so the data coat is making sure that, first of all, your data is consistent. So we're all talking the same units of measure, the same date formats, the same PO formats. We're inputting our suppliers in the same way. Everybody's using the same process. Then it's got to be organized. So that means maybe categorizing it in different ways, and that could be by site, by business unit, by buyer, by team member, by country, by region. And then obviously it's got to be accurate. So define what that is within your organization. So once you've got your consistent, your organized, and your accurate data, it's then trustworthy. And that's the biggest thing missing from a lot of data right now. So for example, we're working on a project right now, cleaning material master descriptions for a manufacturer, and they have set out some new standards. So they have the noun, the modifier, and then we have, maybe it's the material type and then the color, the style, etc. So every single description is being reworked to that format, and anything new will be built to that format. So that's consistency there. That's a good example of creating the consistency. And then from that as well, we're able to identify where there are duplicate products, etc., and clean those up. So that is the data coat. So I say make sure your data has its coat on, and it's not something that you just put on. You need to keep it on all year round as well, no matter how hot it gets in Austin.
Peyton, Susan just described the data coat. I think another really important topic around ERP data accuracy is the impact that it has on a company's revenue or on a company's inventory. And most manufacturers, whether they're manufacturing in-house or not, are carrying some level of inventory of their product. So what can someone do to clean up their data so it can better help with revenue, inventory predictions and managing inventory levels? And this is something that I wanted to throw in there because it actually just came up with one of our clients this week. And so it was very top of mind for me.
So we actually work with this a lot through what I do with Reveal, looking at inventory. What are those average inventory values? What is the dead stock value? What safety stock are you carrying? Because generally safety stock becomes dead stock, but it's necessary in some ways. And I think what we're seeing as a trend right now for manufacturers is, we started with the lean methodology and everybody got into lean. And then 2020 happened and the supply chain kind of went, and everybody's overstocking now because they're so afraid they're going to run out of stuff. And so right now, there seems to be a major dollar impact on carrying a higher average inventory value and ultimately ending up with dead stock than needed because of some of those fears that came out of that. And that ties up working capital. And it's also a liability for the company. So we want to see those average inventory values go down by cleaning up the master data, ordering what we need when we need it, and no more than we actually need to order. And what does that look like? Looking at the production planning processes, looking at lot sizing, supplier constraints, and updating the MRP and lot size procedures accordingly to make sure that everything is aligning with the production plan, sales plan, et cetera. Ultimately, we want those available to promise numbers to be right with the right lead times. And so getting those where we need them in order to meet the production and customer demand and ultimately meet ATP is going to keep our inventory where we need and not inflate it above what may actually be needed. And it's also going to mean you get accurate MRP signals if your inventory is accurate. So if we're not keeping accurate inventory, then no matter how good our MRP procedures are, it's not going to pick up when it needs to pick up that we need to order, or it'll pick up before we need to order. It's just, so I think that is where the master data comes in, and ultimately we'll get your inventory where you need it to be if we keep it accurate and align it with our behaviors in the production process.
Juliet, you've dealt with inventory a lot in your career. You have a background in food and beverage, which is particularly challenging when you're dealing with very time-sensitive items. Same with Matthew, where something comes in and it may only be good for a couple days, it may only good for a week. It's not something that you can just, keep around ongoing. So what would you say is the impact of not being able to project and account for inventory? And have you done anything that has, from a data cleansing perspective, that has helped you personally, you and your teams better manage inventory?
Yeah. No, thank you for that question. I think it's really important. So usually inventory projections are coming from marketing and salespeople, but keeping the right inventory is always the supply chain's responsibility. So we were always the last ones, we meaning supply chain, we were always the last ones, and we were always responsible for it, irrelevant of what the projection is. So we actually had to take a look at and do analytics and kind of study and see what is the seasonality and different things to be able to properly project. And also look at our lead times, right? So a lot of our products were coming from overseas, so lead times were very long. So I just want to say that the best revenue and the best profitability we've ever had was during COVID. And it was totally unexpected. And I continuously had arguments with my CEO, whether I have the right inventory or the wrong, or too high or too low, let me say it that way, right? inventory is a problem which is a very slow and less obvious impact on your business, but it's there and it's creeping. It's creeping up. It impacts your margin, your top line, your reputation, your customer satisfaction. So I'm very, very proud to say that our inventory during COVID was right. And we were actually named to have the highest SLA to our key food distributors, which was KE and UNFI. So we did something right. So I just wanted to start with that. To answer specifically what kinds of things that we look at is, inventory accuracy is very important, and we kind of figured out how to measure that. So inventory accuracy of about 97% over or above is really, really good. And how do you measure it? It's a simple formula. You count your items, you divide it by the items on the record, and you multiply it by 100. If that number is 97% or above, you're doing really well. That obviously says that in your 3PL or in your storage, you do have to do cycle counts, maybe once, twice, sometimes 4 times a year. Very important. You also have to make sure you understand your safety stock. And there's a formula for safety stock that's much more complicated. But in a very simple term, your safety stock very much depend on your turns and on your lead time. Those are the key contributors to your safety stock. And again, I go back to, very simplistic terms, is that you want to take a look at the turns of your product. The 80-20% rules applies, and it applies that 80% of your revenue is coming from 20% of your items. And so, to be honest, to keep your inventory right, really focus on that 20% and understand what's that 20%, because the rest doesn't really matter. I mean, it matters from a customer satisfaction perspective, but it really doesn't matter because the top 20% of your SKUs are driving 80% of your revenue. Not having good projection is bad, but I would challenge that the supply chain team should do that analytics independently and kind of drive inventory based on what they've seen historically. Obviously, you can't predict the COVID. There's certain things you just cannot predict, but you should have a good understanding of what drives your buying patterns, right? And then if you study that, you have certain SKUs that have low turns, increase your advertisement and try to sell those out or decrease your price. There's all kinds of ways that you can get your inventory cleaned, right? But you need to understand that your data has to be right. So I'm assuming, right, that your data is correct, because like all the things I talked to you about earlier on how do you add SKUs and how do you remove SKUs from your ERP. I'd love to address any questions. This is a very exciting topic. I'm obviously very passionate about it. So I hope I helped some people on the call.
So I encourage all of you to connect with our speakers on LinkedIn. They are data geeks and data experts. And when I close out our webinar, I am going to send a 2-minute survey that I'd like to ask each of you to complete. We're asking for feedback on our panel today and also recommendations for future topics. We like to host webinars that are going to add tremendous value to the supply chain manufacturing community. So we'd appreciate you taking a couple minutes to complete that survey. Have a wonderful afternoon and look forward to joining you on a future event.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.